Hey everyone, this is Baphy. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how Bitwig handles dithering versus how Ableton Live handles dithering. In all of my previous 9 videos up to this point in the series, I've been talking about all the things I love about Bitwig compared to Ableton. But dithering is a tricky one. In this area, I actually think Bitwig has some minor issues and can steer a lot of users in the wrong direction if they don't understand how dithering actually works and what it does and when to apply it. So I believe Bitwig gives you some good flexibility to make good choices about dithering, but if you don't understand dithering, it's very easy to make bad choices and pretty much fuck up your music. Dithering is it's a subject that a lot of producers and even engineers don't know very well and argue about even at the expert level, and there's a lot of conflicting advice out there. So I really want to make clear in this video, the stuff I'm going to tell you is my opinion, my approach to dithering, the way I think about dithering. What I'm going to tell you is going to conflict with some things you see in documentation for products like Ozone or FabFilter Pro L, advice you get from other places. And all I can say is it's a wild and woolly world out there, and even the experts sometimes disagree or have fuzzy understandings about dithering and what it does and why you should use it and when you shouldn't use it. I'll also mention that for my income, I've been a technical writer in the software industry for a ridiculously long amount of time. I deal with very, very complex software products that do very complex things like optimization, quadratic equations, AI, lots and lots of economic and math formulas, heavy-duty math and statistics all over the place. So I feel like I have a tech writer's eye for finding ambiguities and contradictions. I also know that when a technical writer who produces help for a product like Ozone or FabFilter, I know full well that when they talk to their subject matter experts about, well, how does this work? Explain it to me. Tell me what I need to tell our users. Sometimes things can get lost in the translation if the tech writer themselves doesn't really know the subject matter really well and can kind of fill in the gaps or address ambiguities in what the subject matter expert tells them. So look, I know this is boring stuff for music producers, but it's just my way of saying I feel pretty confident about the specific approach I use, and I'll leave it up to you whether to agree with me and some of the experts that I side with versus agreeing with the Ozone doc or the FabFilter doc or whatever. It's your choice. Regardless of what you think is the correct way to apply dithering or not, and when to apply dithering, regardless of all that, it's very useful to understand how dithering works in Bitwig versus how dithering works in Ableton. So that's what I'm going to mostly explain, but I'll also explain a few useful basics about dithering if it's something you feel you don't understand really well yet. Okay, so let's jump right into the doc, because I have to show you where to find all this stuff afterwards. I have a separate Google Doc that's specifically the way I think about loudness targets and dithering. And I wrote this because the question comes up all the time on the producer groups I'm a part of. And the answers can be very complex and long, so it's a lot easier sometimes to just point to this doc rather than type the same answer over and over and over again for months and years at a time. Now, I'll link this specific doc in the comments for this video, but you can also, if you just have my main Bitwig Handbook bookmark somewhere, you can also find this doc through the reference links section of my Bitwig Handbook. And just look for this link at the bottom here called Baphy's Thoughts About Loudness and Dithering. Okay, so I think if you've never, ever seen a particular video, I would really counsel you to just pause this video right now, go watch this one video, and then come back and continue, because everything I'm about to say will make a hell of a lot more sense if you've seen and heard the examples that are in this video right here that Ian Shepherd once made. Let's go take a look at it real quick. I'm not going to actually play it for you. I'm just showing you what it looks like and how to get to it.
This video is going to demonstrate.
Okay. So if you're not familiar with Ian Shepherd, he's a relatively well-known mastering engineer, an expert on loudness, a champion for ending the loudness war, a designer of some plugins that help you deal with hitting good loudness targets and dynamic range. Anyway, he's a very technical mastering engineer, and in general, I find most of his observations and advice really good. And this video, watch it. It's only 7 minutes. Take a pause, watch it, come back here. Everything I'm about to say will make so much more sense if you do that. Okay, so I'm assuming you've gone and watched this and you've come back. So let's talk about the problem. This is the problem. If you go to the audio fact sheet for Ableton Live and you look at their section where they talk about dithering, you're going to run into statements like this. Dithering should never be applied more than once to any given audio file, right? It's just, that's an absolute, unambiguous, don't ever do it except one time, and you should only do it when you're mastering and finalizing, right? We go to another manual like FabFilter Pro L. In their manual for their limiter, their mastering limiter, they talk about what their dithering choices are. But down here, they have a little section called Myths and Facts. And, you know, you go, great, this is some really useful stuff. But they're telling you things like, okay, much of today's music is still ridiculously loud. So there's not many dynamics in the final result, and this masks the small level of distortion due to quantization error, or as Ian Shepherd called it in his video, truncation error. They're basically claiming that if you master to a loud volume level, you don't need to dither, because the loudness itself hides the truncation distortion. So they say dithering won't have any audible effect. They also say a lot of audio recordings you make already have a high noise floor because of the analog gear you're using. And in that case, dithering has no effect at all. It just adds noise to the signal. They also say dithering should, again, like Ableton, they say you should only ever use it at the final stage when you're mastering, and blah, 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 blah. Dithering more than once doesn't make any sense. It just increases the overall noise level in your audio. This is almost exactly the same thing the Ableton manual says. They also have this one, which I thought was really interesting. If you're going to master for something that you're going to upload to SoundCloud or Spotify or anything that converts it to MP3 or AAC or Opus, like SoundCloud uses, any kind of lossy format, they think, well, you don't need to dither because they're just going to screw the hell out of your signal and completely change it anyway and make it terrible anyway. So, and they don't have a fixed bit depth, which is when dithering is important, is this notion of fixed versus floating point bit depths. So they say, gosh, you know, if you're ultimately going to upload it to any of the major platforms, you don't need to dither, okay? So they say all this. I believe they're wrong. Ian Shepherd would say they're wrong. Some of the people that also agree with Ian Shepherd and probably informed his opinion to some degree. In my section, I kind of list who they are. I trust Ian Shepherd's analysis of how dithering works, again, as demonstrated in this video. There's a rather famous engineer named Paul Frindle, who he builds SSL consoles, who works for Sony. And there's another respected mastering engineer named Bob Olson. I cannot tell you how many forums and threads and Google research I've done to really see what everyone says about dithering. And these are the people whose opinions about it I trust. And these are the people who my approach is based on, okay? So without going into any more detail about that stuff, oh, well, actually I will. Here's the ozone help documentation for the dithering and their thing. And they have a whole tips and examples section, and they say something like, okay, do not ever perform any processing after you've dithered it with ozone. That sounds a lot like what Ableton and FabFilter are saying, but in this case, ozone is absolutely correct. If you use ozone itself to dither a file, you should not ever touch that file with any kind of processing after that. And there's a reason for that. And this is where I get into technical writers or whoever writes help documentation or support page articles. Sometimes they may be the developers themselves, the subject matter experts themselves, because everyone has different opinions and fuzzy understanding and things get lost in the translation. I can tell you as a tech writer, because I understand the mechanics of dithering and the details of dithering pretty well, I understand exactly why ozone says this. And for ozone in particular, it's true, okay? But the vague general statements about dithering made in the Ableton manual and the FabFilter manual are only kind of half true, and they kind of depend on a lot of specifics. So I'm going to try and clear those up as I go on here. Okay, so let's see what dithering kind of looks like in some of the popular plugins. Let me close all these down for a second. I was just getting them set up. So this is the master bus, and I have a few things in here. I have my own pet mastering chain. This is how I master. I do not use Ozone 8, even though I have it. And I use FabFilter Pro L, but it's actually inside my mastering chain here in the last section. I put my songs through 4 stages, and you could kind of think of the first 3 stages as really being part of a mix processing chain. These aren't strictly mastering. These are setting up the mix to be mastered successfully and have the kind of coloration and detail and gluing and mono cleanup and mud cleanup that I want. So even though I call this a mastering chain, it's really just this last module that is the mastering bits. And in there, I'm using a clipper. I may or may not clean up some resonances that pop to the front and become noticeable after the final loudness squash, because I do heavy festival-oriented bass music. And so I master to a competitive loudness target, not a stupid loudness target, although many engineers would consider even the low end of the loudness wars stupidly loud, but I try and stay in the shallow end of the loudness wars. And then finally, I do use FabFilter Pro L to do my my final limiting. But what's interesting about Pro L is I turn dither off. I do not use Pro L to dither. And I'll explain why as I go along here. Instead, I use a product. My dithering is done with a product I love. I really like Kazrog's stuff. It's simple, it's straightforward. He fills some niches that nobody else fills. I love his K-clip. Is an awesome clipper, and I believe clipping is a really useful technique in a mastering chain for heavy bass-oriented music, if it's done right and your mix is set up right. But at any rate, I really love Kazrog. This is fairly new. It's a super cheap plugin because it probably wasn't hard for him to make. It was only about $10, I think. So if you're serious about dithering, I can't recommend this plugin enough, because it gives you a lot of visibility and control over exactly what's happening when you're doing your dithering. My main problem with FabFilter and Ozone, the FabFilter especially, is your dithering options are opaque. They're like a black box. It's like, well, okay, it's off, or you decide what your target resolution is going to be. Like if I'm dithering to 24 bits, I choose that, and now dithering's turned on, and I basically have a choice between no noise shaping or 3 different types of noise shaping. And everybody uses completely different terminology for their noise shaping. So FabFilter calls it basic, optimized, and weighted. Let's go look at Ozone. They have a whole different way that they talk about their stuff. Here's their dither module. Let's turn it on real quick. So they have this notion of auto blanking, which Master Dither also has, and it's a setting I use and like. I'll let you refer to their doc to understand what's going on, but well, basically it's simple. If there's no signal at all, and it's very, very, there's like literally no signal, instead of having dithering noise happening at that point, it turns off dithering whenever there's no input signal. So it just makes your silent sections truly silent. Then you have bit depth, you have 3 different dithering amounts or off, but you don't know, they just call theirs low, medium, and strong, but what type of dithering is it, right? What does that mean? How is it changing the actual dithering algorithm? They have this special thing that's unique to them called harmonic suppression, which is, it doesn't dither, but it changes the way that the truncation distortion happens. It's kind of a, I'm not even going to go into that. It's fairly complex. They have a way to try and limit the peaks that the dithering noise puts out, although that's, anyway, I won't go into these two. You can figure those out for yourself. And then they have a lot of noise shaping options. But again, their noise shaping options don't follow the algorithms you'll find out there to learn about. They just say low to high to max, whatever. Whereas again, something like Master Dither says it has specific names for its noise shaping that indicate kind of where they came from, and the documentation explains exactly what each noise shaping does. Ozone, to their credit, they try to show you what the noise shaping does. So as I pick each noise shaping curve, they'll kind of show you we're going to add more noise in this range, less noise here, and then more noise again up above about 15, 14K. As we start moving up to max, it's going to be even more drastic with that curve and try and really remove any added noise in the range that humans are very sensitive to. And yet they're adding a crap ton of noise compared to the other noise shaping algorithms up here. So anyway, the basic idea behind noise shaping is this. A dithering algorithm, it'll be easier to understand if we go look at dither quickly in Wikipedia. So here's the basic problem. Something like a sine wave is represented in these tiny little slices according to your audio rate. So 44.1 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz. That means you're taking 48,000 samples per second, or you're taking 44,100 samples per second, and so on. And each one of those samples, it's an analog line. It's a visual curve. There's no jagginess to it, but we have to turn it into numbers. And those numbers basically are these even integer values of bits. Okay, so it kind of makes a stacked, let's see, do they show a good diagram of that? Not really. They don't. They kind of do, but not really. This green line right here, look at this green line and see how there's a little jaggy right here, and there's a little flat jaggy right here, and there's another flat jaggy here. It's flat here, and then this looks more steep, but you can see these little bent points in it. What's happening is this is the first slice, and it's happening at a very high number. And then this is the second slice. It's a smaller number. Here's the third slice, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on. And this is a slice at this particular number. This is a slice at that number. This is the bottom zero of the entire waveform. Another slice, 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 slice. So if you imagine like on a spectrum meter that's broken into octaves and you get those bars instead of actual waveforms, each one of these little jaggies represents where the bars are that, a digital to analog converter turns back into a more normal looking analog wave. So the problem is, this might be what the sample, the waveform, the recorded waveform originally has in it, are these even numbers that represent a bit depth. And then if you put it through any kind of processing at all, and by that I mean adding an EQ curve to it, or even just putting on utility and pushing up the volume a little bit. Anything you do, anything at all that you do to the original sample clip up here is going to modify it's going to do math on those original bit numbers that are in the sample clip itself. And the result looks a lot like this. They come up with these fractional numbers. This is what they call floating point math. Okay, 32-bit float means numbers that look like this, where there's these fine decimal values, and these decimal values can get really big, like 0.4872593 can get really large for the decimal points. So they can be very precise and very closely approximate the original analog shape. The problem is, as long as you stay up in 32-bit float, these are the kinds of numbers that the system sees as your waveform, and it's very accurate and very clean, and there's no problem. But then when you finally freeze or extract or bounce or export or freeze and flatten, any kind of freezing of that internal set of 32-bit float numbers, if you push it back down into a 24-bit sample or a 16-bit sample or an 18-bit sample, what it does, quite literally, is it chops off the decimal points, and it doesn't round up to the nearest number. It literally chops off the decimal point. So if this was the kind of transformation that happened from a processing like pushing it up 20% in volume with the utility plugin in Ableton, then when it chops off all those decimal points, this is the string of numbers you end up with to represent that waveform. And you can see it's nothing like the original 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, and 6. And that's not going to look like a sine wave. If this was a sine wave, that's not going to look like a sine wave at all. This is going to be full of harmonic distortion. And the distortion, because it's harmonic distortion caused by bit truncation, it's referred to as truncation distortion or quantization distortion. Okay? So, long story short, the way to fix this and make these numbers not drift quite that far from the original, when you freeze it back down into a fixed bit kind of sample, 24-bit, 16-bit, etc., the way that they do that is by adding a kind of randomness to it called dithering. And at the end of the day, it ends up looking like, the output numbers from dithering would be a lot closer to the original numbers over time. And so a kind of visual way to understand it, these kind of blotchy squares, this pixelation you see here, kind of shows you what dithering looks like in a visual sense. Like, here's the original photo here, and if you get truncation distortion because you compressed it down in a way to a smaller size, and you don't dither the image, you get these kind of very rough looking bands, and it's very blotchy, and this is truncation distortion in a visual sense. Now when you start adding some noise to the signal, like in this picture here, these little dark green dots, they kind of imply noise. And if we were to blow this up a little bit, you would see that there's a little bit of, you see a few little dots here that aren't as clean as the original picture, but it's still very recognizably close to the original picture. Whereas quantization distortion, or truncation distortion looks like this. So imagine this difference in your audio. Imagine taking a sample, doing some simple processing to it or some complex processing to it, bouncing it from 32-bit floating point down to 24 bits, and you get the equivalent of this, which, again, in that Ian Shepherd video that I told you to look at, he shows you what this looks like in a spectrogram, and it's a huge amount of harmonic distortion. And when he shows you what dithering looks like instead, you see a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of noise across the bottom of the spectrum. And it sounds more recognizably like the original sound, right? Whereas his example with the quantization distortion sounded really weird and grainy, and you could just hear the harmonic overtones and distortions just completely changing the timbre of the original sound. Okay. So that's what's happening mechanically with dither. And the main point about dither that I want you to walk away from is the hiss that's caused by dithering is always, always, always better than truncation distortion. And where I believe Ableton, and where Ian Shepherd believes Ableton and FabFilter get it wrong with some of their advice about dithering, is they say you should only ever do it once. But here's the problem. Let's go to Bitwig for this example. If I drop any kind of sample up in here, just take a random sample. I'm not going to play any of this for you. So if we look at this sample, here's the original sample down here, and you can see that it's a 16-bit stereo sample, 44.1 kilohertz. Actually, let's pick a different one. I want a 24-bit sample. There we go. Let's put this one up here. So this is a 24-bit sample, and if I bounce this to a new track, the first thing Bitwig will ask you is, well, what bit depth do you want? And by default, and this is where I think Bitwig gets it totally wrong for people, by default, it's going to offer a 24-bit bit depth. And if you don't understand what's happening, and before I do that, let me do one simple thing. Let's put tool on here. So I'm going to use their version of utility. They call it tool. And I'm going to turn up the volume a little bit on that sample. Okay. So when this sample gets pushed through tool, Bitwig, like Ableton, is doing all of this in 32-bit floating point math. And so it sounds perfectly clean. It's not upsampling, it's just doing the math in a way that has lots of decimal points, so it's very, very clean and analog looking, right? But if I take this sample in its current form, if I take this clip and I bounce it down to 24 bits, the bounced sample, you can see it's a little louder now. This has quantation distortion, I'm going to say truncation distortion all over it. Every least significant bit, you know, all those decimal points, when they got lopped off, it changed this waveform in a way that's creating that same truncation distortion that Ian Shepherd demonstrated. Now you may go, yeah, but look how loud it is. Am I really going to notice all that truncation distortion that's happening, like right here in this really, really quiet section? Here's where the truncation distortion is happening, is in the quieter parts of the signal right here. And you say to yourself, am I going to notice it? Am I going to hear it? And the answer is no. No, you're not. Not if I do one bounce to this thing and you play it back. You won't hear that truncation distortion at all. And that's what FabFilter is correct about when they say things like they do in their myths and facts page. You're not going to hear it. The problem is, and this is what Ian Shepherd tried to point out in his video, and what I think the tech writers and even the subject matter experts talking to the tech writers maybe got wrong, is that you don't just do one bounce to one sample and that's your song. Instead, especially if you're a bass music producer, you'll bounce something with some processing, and then you'll come over here and you'll put more processing on it, and you'll stretch it, and you'll, oops, that's not what I want. I want that. You know, you'll put something like a pitch shifter on it, and then you might even also take this thing and put it into stretching mode and do something like, you know, this, and then slow it way the hell down by going into stretch mode. And where the hell are you? You way over here? Yeah, you're way over here. You know, you might stretch the file way out to slow it down. And, you know, now it's a whole different size. You know, we play games with it. We do this constant resampling over and over, and then I'll take this and I'll bounce it again. And you'll just keep doing successive bounces like this over and over and over as you warp the sound further from the original and make it really crazy. And then you'll start looking for little, you know, interesting little cuts in here that you can slice up and interject in your song as a cool bass sound or whatever, right? Every time you're doing this kind of bouncing, you're multiplying the original truncation error that's created each time. So in every one of these sort of quieter sections of the sound, like here, there's a little bit of quantization error or truncation error hiding in here on the lower and some of the frequencies. And then you bounce it again, and you're doing it all over again. It's like this had errors in it. It had weird numbers that didn't match the original waveform very well because it was not dithered when we bounced it down. And then you're doing more processing to it, pushing it back into 32-bit float, but then you're truncating it one more time when you bounce to this one. And all these truncation errors get compiled and added on top of each other and summed up. And pretty soon you end up with a sound that has a lot of harmonic distortion that isn't the pleasant kind necessarily. I mean, you might think it sounds okay, you might not notice it, but that's what's going on under the covers. So in a case of extreme resampling over and over, you're getting a quantization error, a truncation error that you may or may not hear or care about or think sound bad. But if you're doing this to clean clips, right? If you're not trying to warp and do crazy sound design, but instead, if you were trying to take this original clip and do some simple processing to it to, you know, turn the volume up on it or maybe do a simple EQ thing. All right, why are you hiding from me now? Because I gotta do you, I gotta do you. Oh, that's right. And it's a -5, of course, -5. Sorry, I don't usually put my plugins with this particular view. I almost always use the side browser. So, you know, you do a little high pass filter, right? Anything like this where your intent is to keep the sound as clean as possible, but do some basic, you know, mix type processing to it. And then you bounce this. And you bounce it to 24-bit with no dithering, and you get a new version of it. And the problem is, this now has that truncation distortion hiding in the quiet parts here. There's a little bit of truncation distortion happening here. And now you say again, well, that's not so bad. I can't hear it. What's the big deal? Well, the problem is you're doing this all over a project with 40 or 50 tracks. You're putting processing on every single track. And then you're summing all those tracks up at the master to make your mix, your final song, and all those harmonic distortions being added by all the tiny little quantation, truncation, you know, errors that are happening in quieter parts of the waveform are being piled on top of each other and summed up. And by the time it gets to your full mix, you're going to start hearing it. This is why you can get into a situation where your song just has some weird, harsh, not good sounding. You might think it's resonance. You might think it's just kind of slightly metallic sounding or not as smooth and clean as you might want it to be. And it's caused by this pileup of truncation distortion if you're not dithering every time you bounce. Or if you're not just making sure all your bounces stay in 32-bit floating point. The other thing that's kind of important to know is even here in the louder parts of the waveform, if I zoom in right here, you'll notice that even in a loud portion of a waveform, there's still lots of quiet bits, little bits that aren't that far off of, you know, the zero crossing. And then any one of these peaks might also have been kind of radically moved a little bit from the quantation distortion, like they're not exactly where they were in the original 32-bit floating point. So it's not just your small quiet bits that are going to add up and do strange things across a 50-channel mix, right? It's everything is gonna, there's always low frequencies hiding in everything. For example, if I just put a good spectrum analyzer on here, like put HOFA on here. I'm going to mute the master so you don't actually hear this. Okay, so this is the spectrum for that sound, or both of those sounds really, doesn't matter. The point is, let me just freeze this and clear this out. Okay. Every sound usually has stuff happening in the high end and at the low end that is a certain amount of signal. You can't hear it. Your ears are focused on all the energy up here. This is what's poking through the mix. This is what you hear. But these quiet bits, you can't just chop them off or roll them off with really steep low pass filters and high pass filters. You can't do that because you'll introduce phase problems right around the cutoff points for those, the roll-off points for those filters. So you leave a lot of this sound in there. And here, there's a lot of very low-level truncation, distortion, hiding if you bounce without dithering. And again, this stuff adds up. This is where the quantization noise is happening. And just remember this, you want dither noise here. You don't want quantization noise. You don't want truncation, distortion here. You want simple white noise, which is what dithering adds, okay? That's what you want here. Trust me on that. And again, Ian Shepard's video shows you exactly what this looks like and why. Okay, so with that in mind, that's the pitfalls and gotchas. Here's what Live itself, what Ableton does really well to keep producers safe. Producers who do not understand dither and when to dither can't really get into trouble in Ableton. Ableton was smart. They basically said, okay, if you want to freeze a track, we'll freeze it, and there's a sample hiding there, and we're going to make it a 32-bit floating point sample, and you don't have a choice. You can't push it down to any different bit depth. Freezes are always 32-bit float. And if you drag off the actual audio sample from that and put it somewhere, here's the frozen sample, it's still 32-bit. Oh, why did you drag the whole track? You're not supposed to do that. That was odd. Let's try this. That's better. Okay, no shit, you're still frozen. I could have sworn I used to be able to drag off a frozen clip onto a new track and the new track would not be frozen. Well, either way, let's unfreeze that track. Let's do it a different way. Some people would say, well, let's just resample it. So you make a new audio track, you set it up to record, you right click and do resample. Fuck you, you do. Sorry. I've been away from Ableton for about 4 months now, so I'm starting to forget this crap, where these things are hiding. Okay. You'd set up a new channel for resampling and you would actually record this, and it would basically do the same thing as a Bitwig bounce. Okay, put the processed version of this freeze onto a new track as just a plain old bounced audio clip. And when you do a resample or a freeze and flatten, like now that I've frozen that track, I can flatten it, and now it's been processed with the volume boost. And this is a 32-bit float sample. There's no possibility of any kind of truncation, distortion from any kind of operation inside of Ableton that makes new bounces one way or another, whether it's freeze and flatten, whether it's resampling, or any of that. So you only have to think about dithering one time in Ableton, and that's when you're doing file export. This is the only place dithering comes into play. And you might be doing exports for a master, or you might be doing exports of stems to hand off to a collab partner or something. And this is the only point where you have to make decisions about bit depth and dither. Okay, so most of us are going to export our masters as 24-bit waves. There's not much point ever anymore in actually exporting a 16-bit master. if you're uploading to any kind of platform that converts it to MP3, AAC, Opus, etc., SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Music, your distributor at DistroKid or TuneCore or whatever, you always want a 24-bit master because they convert to those lossy formats of MP3 and whatever a little bit more cleanly because they have more information to work with. They have better looking waveforms to start with. So most of us are always going to export our masters as 24-bit, and then the only decision you have to make is, well, do I dither or not? And Ableton's manual will tell you if you're not sure whether that thing you're exporting is ever going to go through more processing of any sort, if it's going to have another plugin put on it to tweak it in any way, shape, or form, they tell you in their documentation, always pick triangular if you suspect that it's going to be processed further, okay? FabFilter will tell you, no, don't dither at all, depending on what you're doing. But triangular is generally considered in most of the product documentation out there to be the safest form of dither. It's like if you're not sure whether you want to dither or not and you don't understand dithering, pick triangular and you won't get in too much trouble either way, right? So a lot of us will export at 24-bit triangular, and that's fine. Now, those of us who have read up on noise shaping, we'll start maybe thinking about using one of these power noise shaping algorithms. I'm not going to go into that just yet. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the point is, the only place Ableton makes you think about dithering is when you're exporting files, either your master or stems, okay? I guess I'll just tell you right now, because I probably won't remember to circle back to this. If you're exporting stems to give to a collab partner, I recommend you always do them as 32. And when you do a 32 export, it's really 32-bit float, not 32-bit fixed point. And it automatically disables the dither box. I can't select any dither options when it's set to 32. I can only select dither if it's 24 or 16. But if I set it to 32, I can't select dither. So what this is telling you is I'm going to export these big, huge wave files for each track, you know, and they're going to be in 32-bit floating points, so they're going to be really pristine, and they're not going to have any kind of distortion or error on them at all. They're going to be exactly like what you hear and what I play to you in you know, playback mode. And this is what you always want to hand off to collab partners. Never, ever hand a 24-bit stem to a partner. Always 32-bit. Otherwise, each time you pass stems back and forth, even if you did dither, it's going through this unnecessary process of truncating bits and changing the waveform from what you actually hear when you play back in your DAW, okay? If you hand them a 32-bit set of stems, they're going to hear exactly what you hear, and Live's going to see exactly what Live sees over on your computer, okay? So always 32-bit for stems, and generally 24-bit for masters. And whether or not you dither and which dithering option you pick, well, I'll talk about that some more in a minute when I get into my specific advice. Okay, so that's how it works in Ableton. And the main point, again, that I'm trying to make here is Ableton keeps you out of trouble by limiting the total number of places you have to make a decision about dithering. Now, Bitwig gives you a lot more flexibility. They give you more rope, but you can hang yourself with that rope. And again, they give it to you every place you do a bounce of any sort. If you do a bounce, they say, well, what bit depth do you want? And you say, oh, well, I guess I want 24-bit, or I don't understand, so I'll leave it at the default because this is what it is by default. And also by default, dither is turned off. And so people using Bitwig could very easily sit here and happily do bounces and resamples and resamples and bounces and bounces and resamples and exports and handing off stems to their partner and so on, and never realize that they're creating all this truncation distortion in their files. And really, you know, every time they do that, it's changing the file in a fairly bad way. Okay, so two rules of thumb, and it's mainly if you're going to bounce inside of Bitwig, if you're doing any resampling or bouncing of any sort, leave it on 32-bit floating point. This option wasn't even in Bitwig version 1. They didn't add this until Bitwig version 2, and it's because a lot of users are like, hey, I really want 32-bit bounces, 32-bit floating point bounces, because I understand dither and I know that what you're doing and giving me only 24-bit bounces is not keeping things the same every time I bounce. It's not keeping the fidelity and cleanness of the signal every time I bounce. So they finally added this, and that's good. A thing to know about so you don't get pestered by that all the time is in the user settings, under behavior, where are you hiding? There it is. So in the behavior tab of user settings, there's a bounce setting. And you can basically say, what do you want the default bounce to be? And I highly recommend, if you haven't done this already and you're watching this video and going, oh crap, for the first time, come over here into settings and set this baby to 32-bit floating point. And then it's like Ableton. Then you don't have to think when you bounce, because every time you bounce, it's just going to be coming up with 32-bit floating point by default, and dither doesn't matter. In fact, I think even if you check that dither checkbox, it's not actually going to apply dither to a 32-bit. I would hope their logic is smart enough not to do that. If any Bitwig devs are watching this, maybe think about disabling this checkbox entirely if someone has 32-bit picked here. But either way, I'm going to guess this is harmless. But if it's set to 32-bit by default, you can bounce your heart out. Never going to worry about introducing any truncation, distortion. Your sound files are going to be as clean as possible. It's going to work just like Ableton. So this is the biggest, most important thing I wanted to show you in this video. Now, over on the export side, you have all the same choices as Ableton, kind of. Again, usually if you're exporting a master, you want to pick 24-bit. If you're exporting stems to pass off to a collaboration partner, you want 32-bit floating point, period. Now, what's interesting about Bitwig is they don't give you a bunch of different dither options if you're exporting a master to 24-bit. You just have a choice of either dither on or dither off. What's happening under the covers is a black box, but I'll make some guesses. Here's the Bitwig user guide, and the only thing they say about dither is we add a very small amount of noise. It's generally inaudible, okay? So they took the route, the tech writer there took the route of, I'm not gonna say any more than I need to. If I read between the lines, everyone knows that a triangular dither is the best type of dither, it's the safest type of dither. It's the one that screws up your original signal the least, and it's also the one that makes it so that the noise added during dithering doesn't do strange things if you add more processing to it. So I'm going to guess, without knowing for sure, that when you use 24-bit and select dither, it's applying simple triangular dithering. Going back to my master track for just a second. Are you still there? Yeah. In Kazrog master dither, this is called TDPF. This is the technical abbreviation for triangular dithering. This is triangular, this is rectangular, and this is Gaussian. And the way it works in Kazrog is I'll use this to dither, and I'll manually pick what my target bit depth is. I don't like to use any noise shaping at all. I like to use triangular, and I like to have auto blanking enabled. So this is my default, and I almost never change this, even on masters. It's okay to use noise shaping in masters, and we'll talk about that next, and we'll talk about what noise shaping is. So before I move into that noise shaping stuff, though, the main thing I want to point out is when you do a bounce, if for some reason you want to bounce to 24-bit, like maybe you're using clips to make samples for a sample pack. And this is really convenient. In Ableton, it's a pain in the ass to make 24-bit samples to sell in a sample pack because inside of Ableton, you cannot bounce to 24-bit. So instead, you have to bounce everything to 32-bit and get everything set up and chop up your clips. And then either have to manually export each clip on its own track from Ableton as 24-bit with dither, or you have to take all of your exported, well, all of your saved 32-bit samples inside of the Ableton project folder and run them through some third-party utility to do the bit depth conversion and apply dithering at that time. So Bitwig says, why go through all that hassle? We'll let you bounce directly to 24-bit inside of Bitwig. You know, if I wanted to turn this into a sample to sell for a sample pack, if this was a sample clip, a terrible sample clip, but you know, let's say I wanted to sell that as a sample clip. If I bounce it to 24-bit and turn on dithering, it's a perfectly good sample to sell, and it's right there in my project folder, and I can just pull all those out, you know, give them useful names, pull them out, sell them in a sample pack. So that's one of the reasons Bitwig is nice and flexible. It's just you can get in trouble. But again, to really beat this horse into the ground, you don't get a choice of what type of dithering. And I'm pretty sure they just use simple triangular dithering. And you always want to turn dither on if you're doing a bounce inside the project and if you're bouncing to a lower bit depth, if you're bouncing it down to a fixed 24-bit depth. But if you're not, leave dither off. If your goal isn't to sell samples, always leave it at 32-bit floating point and don't worry about the dither, and you'll be in good shape. Okay, so now let's talk about noise shaping and why you might choose the noise shaping options in Ableton, why you might choose something other than triangular, or why you might choose to sorry, I gotta go find things. You know, if you decide you want to use FabFilter for your mastering and your dithering, and so you turn on dither and you set it to 24 bits, and then you set the noise shaping curve. Why would you pick any one of these curves? All right, they all look different. Every vendor uses different algorithms. They give them their own pet names. As you saw, they're just different everywhere. So you have to read the doc and understand what the noise shaping is doing. But in general, what all of the noise shaping algorithms are doing is trying to push the added noise up, higher up in the spectrum and further down in the spectrum so that less noise is added where humans have the most sensitivity. You know, this is kind of based on Fletcher-Munson curves. Now, this can be a really good thing for a final master that will never, ever be processed again. And it's mostly a good thing for very dynamic material like orchestral recordings or jazz, things that have a huge dynamic range and a lot of very quiet sections, because in a really quiet section, you might start noticing the floor noise a tiny bit. It might be subliminal. You might not consciously notice it, but it's there. So the general idea of noise shaping is it says, well, we need to add a certain amount of noise to the signal so that it doesn't end up with horrible truncation distortion. But we want to push the noise into ranges that are less audible, especially at very low volumes, like the fade at the beginning of a song or end of a song, or super quiet sections in an orchestral package, and so on. The problem is, and the reason that you get warnings to never, ever further process a file, for example, if you've exported it, if you've dithered it with Ozone. Remember I pointed out in the Ozone manual, it said do not do any further processing if you have dithered it. Well, that's true when it's Ozone, because all of their algorithm that they call mbit is basically almost always noise shaped. If you turn off the noise shaping, then the manual doesn't apply. The warning isn't appropriate because it's an even amount of noise added across a signal. If you do this, it's basically kind of sort of like triangular dithering without any noise shaping added to it. But they obfuscate that and give it their own fancy name and stuff. And I'm not really sure what their different algorithms are, why they use low, medium, and high instead of triangular, rectangular, Gaussian, or, you know, they don't describe what any of this stuff actually does. It's a black box. So in general, even if this is off, because I don't know how the dithering itself is done, probably a good idea not to ever do further processing if you have dithered it with ozone. And certainly not if you've picked any one of the noise shaping curves, because here's what happens if you process it further. If I output a mix with, a pretty high dithering curve like this, it's tucked a whole bunch of noise up above like 16K here or 18K. And it's also added a lot of noise to the low bass region and sub-region. And if I load this into another DAW and want to do a remix of it, right? I want to chop it up and use sections of it in a remix song. Well, I've suddenly got all this hugely extra added noise in various parts of the spectrum that's now being processed again and summed up again with other noise that I'm going to be adding to my final export of that remix. And so this is an unavoidably high amount of noise, and it's going to start, if I do further processing, the noise that they're hiding up in the high frequencies is going to start bleeding its way down into more audible frequencies. That's essentially the problem. And this is essentially why you get warnings to never ever do any processing after you dither, or the converse of that is only apply dithering as a very last step and only apply it one time. All of those statements like that really apply only when you've used noise shaping that do this trick, where they stick a lot of noise in areas of the spectrum you won't hear if you only do it one time. But if you start processing this further and adding more dithering, and the processing itself and the bit truncation will take this extra noise and start bleeding it down here into the ranges you can hear, and it's going to murk up your mud region and your bass region. It's going to be adding a lot of white noise type noise down here, and this stuff's going to add up quick and it's going to sound crappy. So the basic rule of thumb really, and now I'm going to get to my book and start talking about the specific do's and don'ts. Let's just go to the top, all the way to the top. Here's my bullet points in a nutshell. It's always better to have dithering than truncation. You should always, always, always dither when you print, meaning bounce or export or flatten. When you print sound to anything other than 32-bit floating point, always make sure dithering is on, always. And I talked about this already. Pre-masters and collab stems should be dithered unless they're 32-bit float. So collab stems, especially if you just leave them 32-bit float, you're fine. But your masters are typically going to be 24-bit. So you aren't going to want to dither those. The whole advice in the FabFilter manual that implies that if you are going to be converting that file to MP3 or any other lossy platform, you don't need to dither. They don't say that exactly, but it's easy to walk away with that interpretation. And it's wrong. It's dead wrong. Even if you're exporting a 24-bit master that's going to go onto SoundCloud or whatever, dither it always, okay? If you can do it in your DAW, which we can in Bitwig, you always want to set up your DAW to use 32-bit floating point for internal bounces. And we talked about that already. And then this is the part I'm talking about now. Never, ever, ever use noise shaping except in a final master export, okay? Because that noise will really screw you up. That shaped noise will mess you up bad if you do any further processing to it. And then finally, my specific advice, and this comes from Ian Shepherd and those other engineers I mentioned earlier in the video, it's almost always the best choice to use no noise shaping, almost always. And if you're going to use noise shaping, you want to listen really closely. And the main advice I have here is, let's jump down to that section. Where do I talk about it? It really boils down, if you're going to use noise shaping, you better trust your room and your monitors and your ears. because your room can lie to you. We all know that, especially as small bedroom producers. Um, you need to know what you're listening for. You need to listen to kind of quiet sections and fades, not the loudest drop of your song. You need to be in a really quiet portion of your song, and you need to crank up your monitors as loud as you can stand it because you're trying to hear what's happening down near the noise floor. It's very hard to actually monitor for this unless it's an ideal section of music, or unless you make a test print where you like turn your master volume way down and burn off an export of that, and then listen to that export with your volume knob for your monitors cranked way the hell up. It's the only way you're going to hear what the noise applied by the noise shaping of the dither actually sounds like and is actually doing to the music. Now you can kind of hear it even on at normal listening levels with your normal volume and your normal, like, super loud masters. You can kind of hear the effect of noise shaping if you just toggle between the different noise shaping types while you're listening to playback, but it's really hard to hear the differences. It's super hard to hear the differences. It'll be subliminal. So like, when I'm using Kazrog, sometimes I find myself preferring to use the K2 noise shaping for certain types of songs. Other times I just don't want any noise shaping at all, and it's pretty easy for me. I know what to listen for and how to listen for it. So I just basically will, for any given song, I'll just say, well, let's see what K2 sounds like. Let's see what K1 sounds like. Let's see what none sounds like. And I'll just do a little bit of careful monitoring with my ears and decide which one of these I like the overall sound of the best, right? That's the easy way to do noise shaping, but you got to trust your ears. If you don't trust your ears, if you don't know what to listen for, my advice is just never use noise shaping, even on your master exports. But I leave it up to you. It's a good thing to experiment with, and there we go. So that's all I have to say about dithering. Thanks for hanging with me this long. And as always, if you have appreciated the time I put into this and the stuff I try to show you, please do me a solid and follow these links to my SoundCloud and Spotify pages and throw me a follow. That would be really great. All right, take it easy. Bye-bye.